Over the last several decades, the dairy industry has turned into one of the most powerful and lobbied for industries in the Western world. Until the turn of the century, milk was produced mainly for home and local use, and it was not until the early 1900s that it became a common part of the Western diet. There were a few factors that contributed to this sudden rise in demand. As infant mortality rose in cities, practices for making milk safer began to emerge. Louis Pasteur is credited with revolutionizing the safety of milk with his discovery of pasteurization in 1862, which made it possible to store and distribute milk beyond the farm. Then in 1884, the first glass milk bottle was patented by Dr. Henry Thatcher, which meant that farmers no longer had to distribute milk in open buckets. A growing interest in nutrition emerged around the same time, and this led to the idea of treating sick people by giving them only the purest, simplest things to eat. The first tank trucks for transporting milk were put into service in 1914, and then in 1919, the milk specialists of the dairy division of the USDA began to organize educational milk campaigns in cities and in rural communities to deal with surpluses generated by the increased production of milk and dairy products during World War I. As a result of ongoing milk campaigns, substantial increases in the consumption of milk occurred. In the 1930s, milk cans were replaced with large, on-farm storage tanks, and plastic-coated milk cartons were invented, which allowed for wider distribution of fresh milk. For the next 40 years, milk consumption soared. During World War II, artists were paid to illustrate pro-milk propaganda posters, touting it as everything from good for teeth to great for warmth. In 1946, the National School Lunch Act was passed with the intention of providing a free or low-cost lunch to every public school child in America. 1 pint of whole milk became a required part of each federally mandated lunch scheme. In January of 1977, the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs, led by George McGovern, released a report of dietary goals, known as the McGovern Report, which recommended that all Americans reduce their fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol consumption, and increase their carbohydrate consumption to 55 or 60% of daily calories. At the time the McGovern Report was published, animal fat intake from dairy foods was at an all-time high, and so was the death rate from heart disease and strokes. Needless to say, the dairy industry didn't respond well to that, and demanded that the dietary goals be withdrawn and reformulated to have the endorsement of the food industry. Eventually, along with the meat industry, they managed to get the whole Senate Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs disbanded and replaced by the USDA. The problem with that, though, is that the USDA's job is to look after producers of food, not people's health. As you can imagine, this has created numerous conflicts of interest when it comes to animal foods such as dairy that have been shown to increase risks of most chronic diseases. You see, if the USDA follows the science, it would violate its duty to promote the agriculture industry. But if it protects the industry, it would violate its duty to issue science-based dietary advice. And clearly, the USDA has most often responded by choosing industry over science. By the time the first USDA dietary guidelines were published in 1980, the dairy industry had managed to convince the government to triple their recommended allowance for dairy consumption. So the industry did get their way, but the public was starting to become suspicious from all the conflicting information. During the 1980s and 90s, the dairy industry launched the infamous Got Milk campaign in an effort to reverse falling sales. They used propaganda tactics similar to the tobacco industry of the 1950s in an effort to make milk drinking cool by using celebrities and making false claims that milk is helpful to maintain bone health and prevent osteoporosis. This claim was finally proven to be false in 1997 by a large-scale Harvard study which followed 72,000 women for 2 decades and found no evidence that drinking milk can prevent bone fractures or osteoporosis. Another study of more than 96,000 people found that the more milk men consumed as teenagers, the more bone fractures they experience as adults. Countries with the largest consumption of dairy products also have the highest risks of osteoporosis. Cow's milk is full of sulfur-containing amino acids, which acidify in the blood when we eat dairy. In order to neutralize this acidity, the body leaches calcium from the bones where it can be dissolved into the bloodstream, leading to weaker bones and loss of calcium. In 1998, the Weston A. Price Foundation initiated the Real Milk campaign, which claimed that raw cow's milk was nature's perfect food. Although cow's milk might be ideal for growing baby cows, it is far from a perfect food for humans. Cow's milk is specifically suited to meet the nutritional needs of herd animals who double their weight in only 47 days, weigh 300 pounds within 14 weeks, and grow 4 healthy stomachs. Cow's milk contains 3 times as much protein as human milk and about 50% more fat. Milk and other dairy products are now the top sources of artery-clogging saturated fat in the Western diet. Casein, the main protein found in cow's milk, is ideal for building a calf's tissues, but is extremely difficult for humans to properly break down, creating acidic residue when metabolized, and in the case of young children, causing many serious health problems, including colic, earaches, sore throats, and many other chronic conditions. Regular consumption of dairy products has also been linked to prostate cancer, lung cancer, breast cancer, and ovarian cancer due to the high levels of naturally occurring growth hormones found in all milk. These hormones, also known as insulin-like growth factor 1, are designed for baby calves and cause the human body to grow at an unnatural rate. In addition to promoting cancer growth, IGF-1 in dairy has also been linked with diarrhea, anemia, gastrointestinal bleeding, kidney disease, eczema, bronchitis, allergies, asthma, hay fever, rheumatoid arthritis, hives, allergy to penicillin, leukemia, multiple sclerosis, and dental decay, as well as to diabetes, obesity, and atherosclerosis caused by the high fat and cholesterol content. According to renowned nutrition researcher Dr. T. Colin Campbell, dairy milk protein may be the single most significant chemical carcinogen to which humans are exposed. Because animals on dairy farms are forced to produce a lot more milk than they are designed to, their udders often become very swollen and they develop conditions like mastitis. Pus and blood from these infections get sucked right into the milk itself, and because it's impossible to get rid of all this pus and blood in the filtration process, a significant quantity of these contaminants end up in the finished product. In Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, up to 400,000 somatic pus cells are legally allowed in every milliliter of milk. In the US, the maximum limit is 750,000 somatic pus cells, and in some countries, such as Brazil, the maximum limit is up to 1 million. Now keep in mind that more than 65% of the world's population is unable to properly digest milk, yet developed countries around the world continue to market dairy products as necessary for human health. But what about all the legitimate studies out there showing that milk is in fact healthy? Well, when it comes to products like milk that have an enormous amount of financial backing by their industry, it's important to keep in mind where this funding for these studies is coming from. The funding effect describes the uncanny correlation between the conclusion desired by a funding source and the conclusion reached by the researchers being funded. The funding effect and the strategy of manufacturing uncertainty has been used with great success by manufacturers of dangerous products to oppose public health regulation. To resist regulation, industries fund scientific reviews to downplay the risks of their products. Studies that are funded by the industry have been shown to be more likely to reach favorable conclusions about their sponsors' products, and in fact, when they looked at studies done specifically with milk, it turned out that none of the interventional studies that were done with industry support had an unfavorable conclusion. As an example, in 2008, the global dairy industry held a meeting where they decided that one of their main priorities was to neutralize the negative impact of milk fat by regulators and medical professionals. They set up a major, well-funded campaign to come up with proof that saturated fat does not cause heart disease. They assembled scientists who were sympathetic to the dairy industry, provided them with funding, encouraged them to put out statements on milk fat and heart disease, and arranged to have them speak at scientific meetings. And the scientific publications we've seen emerging since then have done just what they set out to do, despite the fact that there is a global scientific consensus to limit saturated fat intake to at least under 10% of calories, with the prestigious US Institute of Medicine and the European Food Safety Authority recommending to push saturated fat consumption down as low as possible. We know dairy is killing us, yet milk consumption is still on the rise in many developed and developing nations. Cheese consumption in particular has nearly tripled in the last 40 years, thanks to industry partnering with chains and restaurants to sneak more cheese into menus and by paying food companies to add more milk ingredients into their products. And as a result, dairy has become the largest source of saturated fat in the Western diet. But the horror show doesn't end there. Many people believe that dairy products cause no harm or suffering to the animals themselves, but this could not be further from the truth. In fact, in many ways, animals who are raised for their milk suffer even more than those who are raised for meat. Cows today are forced to produce a far greater quantity of milk than they ever would in nature. This is accomplished through the manipulation of food and of hormones. Cows naturally will only produce just enough milk to satisfy their calf, but dairy farmers have discovered that by feeding cows a diet rich in cholesterol, they can get them to produce a lot more milk. Cows are of course naturally herbivores, but it has become standard practice for dairy farmers to feed their cows feed enriched with animal flesh from the byproducts of slaughtered fish, birds, and other mammals, to the point where cows are now the biggest consumers of fish on the planet. In order to produce milk, cows, like all mammals, must first become pregnant. This is accomplished by extracting semen from a bull kept specifically for that purpose, inserting it into a sperm gun, and then artificially inseminating the female by shoving that sperm gun elbow deep into the cow's vagina and firing it. In nature, a cow will typically not have her first calf until she is at least 3 years old, but dairy farmers can't afford to pay for cows that aren't producing milk. So female dairy calves are forcefully impregnated as soon as possible, usually within a year or less, so that they can start producing milk right away. As soon as the mother gives birth, the calf is immediately removed, which is one of the most traumatic things that can happen to a mother and her child. If the calf is female, she will be raised to start producing milk like her mother as soon as possible. If the calf is a male, he will either be raised for the veal industry or slaughtered on the spot if veal industry demand is low. Calves that are raised for veal are kept in dark crates, chained at the neck so that their flesh stays tender, fed a diet low in iron so that their flesh remains pale, and slaughtered after only a few months. The mother will then be hooked up to a milking machine and milked 2 to 3 times every single day for the next 8 months. Right after the cow begins to be milked, she is again inseminated with the sperm gun, which means she is both pregnant and lactating at the same time, and is only taken off the milking machine during the last 2 months of her pregnancy. As soon as she gives birth, the baby is again taken away, and she goes back on the milking machine and is raped and inseminated again. Cows are not designed to have this constant pressure inflicted upon them. The strain of being pushed to produce such unnatural quantities of milk and to constantly bear calves causes their udders to become permanently stretched far beyond what they would be in nature, and their ankles to become swollen and sore from standing constantly on concrete. Cows can naturally live to be up to 25 years old, but on dairy farms, most cows start to break down after only about 5 years old. And once they stop producing milk at a profitable rate, they are sent to slaughterhouses where they are killed for cheap hamburger meat and pet food. These practices occur even on so-called humane farms, as the goal of any farm is to compete economically. Farms that claim to be humane and organic are still exploiting these animals and treating them as machines to profit off of, as opposed to individuals with their own rights and desires. Aside from the inevitable cruelty that these animals are forced to endure, the industry as a whole is incredibly damaging to the environment and uses up enormous quantities of the Earth's natural resources. In dairy operations, water is required not only to hydrate the cows, but also to grow their food and clean the floors, walls, and milking equipment of these facilities. 98% of milk's water footprint can be traced back to the cow's diet. The amount of milk that dairy animals are forced to produce requires an enormous amount of energy, which can only be replenished by eating more food, primarily in the form of grass and alfalfa. It takes around 6 pounds of alfalfa to produce just 1 gallon of milk. To grow those 6 pounds of alfalfa requires 683 gallons of water. One dairy cow can produce up to 7 gallons of milk per day, meaning that 4,781 gallons of water are used per cow every day just to meet their food needs. When you add up the water used for food, hydration, and cleaning, the average dairy cow uses up a staggering 4,954 gallons of water every day. When you multiply that to account for the 700 cows on a typical dairy farm, that's 3.4 million gallons of water being used every single day. And in the US alone, there are over 9 million dairy cows. Cows also produce large amounts of methane, which has been shown to trap up to 100 times more heat into the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. It's estimated that cows produce between 250 and 500 pounds of methane each day. Going back to our dairy farm example with 700 cows, that's up to 350,000 pounds of methane being pumped into the atmosphere each day. To put that into perspective, a single fracking well is responsible for the release of only 30,000 pounds of methane per day. Of all the dairy products, none is more carbon intensive than cheese. For every 1 kilogram of cheese produced, 13.5 kilograms of carbon dioxide are released into the air. On average, each American consumes about 33 pounds of cheese every year, so an individual's cheese habit alone can contribute 400 pounds of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere annually. Fortunately, there are now a wide range of plant-based milks, cheeses, yogurts, butters, and ice creams that are not only healthier, but are much less damaging to the environment and do not require other sentient beings to be exploited. In the last 2 years alone, plant-based dairy products have seen a rapid rise in popularity, with over $2.1 billion in sales and 14.4% growth in total volume. The quality and variety of these products is improving dramatically as more and more companies respond to the rapidly growing demand for plant-based dairy. For many of us, milk and cheese have become symbolic comfort foods that we consider to be very important to us. But we live in a time now where we don't need to hurt animals and the environment to have these same experiences. The dairy industry is deeply embedded in our culture's history, but each time we sit down, we have the power to change that story and to refuse to take part in this brutal, violent system. It takes only 21 days to break a habit, and all the tools and resources already exist to help you make the switch to a plant-based diet.